Hello, workers of the world. I'm James Mastriani.
And I'm Matt Newell.
We're writers, comedians, performers, and most importantly, we're the hosts of Good Work.
That's right. It's a comedic roundtable about the world of working in which we discuss labor politics, union news. We have fantastic guests.
Yeah, like Jeff Bezos called us from his spaceship one time.
Yeah, he's always listening.
Hi, Jeff.
So join us and producer Jake on Good Work, available at goodworkpod.com or wherever you're listening to this podcast right now.
It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Greetings, Quiller Nation, and welcome to yet another exciting episode of exploration into the greatest literary mystery of all time. Episode 99. It is incredible to believe the size of our growing library of content, but a little simple math of 4 years multiplied by an average of 2 episodes per month finds us here where we are today, fellow Quillers. Before I introduce our next guest from halfway around the world, I want to take a few minutes to thank you all for doing your part to help us continue this great journey each fortnight as producer Jake and I work week in and week out to keep quality content coming your way. And we'd like to remind you of ways that you can help us do what we do. The easiest way to give us a little boost is to make sure you rate and review the show at the various platforms where you stream your content. A few moments to give us a 5-star rating and a few words of support helps others out there discover the series and become fellow Quillers. Of course, another way to directly support the show is to visit our Patreon page and become a patron of the series. Every little bit helps cover the costs of production and gets us closer to our goal of being able to add additional content. Whether you sign up to contribute a mere $5 per month, the cost of a single Starbucks coffee, or you join at the serial Quiller level of $20 per month in order to access our growing collection of bonus features, we appreciate your support for the program and the advancement of the spread of information to the rest of the world about this important literary mystery. All you have to do is visit our website homepage at don'tquillthepodcast.com, click on the red Patreon button, and sign up at the level that you wish to provide continued support. Member organizations out there ask for $40 to $80 per year to access their content. That's somewhere between $3 and $7 per month. And if you do that averaging, right? But here at just $5 per month, you'd be supporting each episode at the rate of $2.50 each. That's a pretty awesome deal, $2.50 per episode. And of course, don't forget, at the serial Quiller level, you're not just supporting the program, but you're also entered into our Quiller of the Month contest, where you not only get acknowledged for your support, but also score yourself some cool Quiller swag. And speaking of killer Quiller swag, that's another great and fun way to support the program. Go to our Quiller swag shop and order a t-shirt or a coffee mug or a hat, and know that every penny of proceeds goes towards keeping the episodes coming. As always, we thank you for choosing us as a source of information and entertainment surrounding the greatest literary mystery of all time. And now, let's go ask some questions. I'd like to introduce my guest today. My guest today grew up in Birmingham, England, near Stratford-upon-Avon, where his early years were marked by frequent visits to Stratford to see performances by the Royal Shakespeare Company. He graduated from Bristol University in English and Greek and has a master's degree in Shakespeare Studies from Birmingham University, as well as a postgraduate diploma in teaching English from Leeds University and a PhD in English as an international language from Nottingham University. He is the author of 20 or so course books for learners of English and worked for the British Council as the head of teacher training in Thessaloniki, that's in Greece. He also taught a Shakespeare course at the University of Thessaloniki and drama for foreign language teachers at the University of Edinburgh, as well as ESADE SAID in Barcelona, Spain. He has also conducted courses on English literature featuring Shakespeare, Austen, Dickens, the modern English novel, and the Romantics for state school teachers in Madrid. He has traveled widely across Europe and Latin America, lecturing in English teaching methodology and performing with his English language voice theater. He has adapted Shakespeare and many other writers for students of English in performances involving both teachers and students. And in 2016, he conducted an international tour of his production, All the World's a Stage, which includes, of course, extracts from a number of Shakespeare plays. His doctoral thesis, English as a Lingua Franca, a corpus-based approach, was published by Continuum in 2010. And he is also the co-author of the award-winning Teacher's Handbook, Dealing with Difficulties, which received the Duke of Edinburgh English Language Award and garnered him an invitation to Buckingham Palace. Since retiring from English language teaching, he has continued with seminars and webinars for language teachers, including a seminar on Shakespeare's Unruly Women. We'll talk to him about that in a moment. And a webinar on the Shakespeare Authorship Mystery. It is my absolute pleasure to welcome Dr. Luke Prodromou to the program. Luke, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Stephen, for inviting me. It's a pleasure.
You have such an illustrious list of credits. It is so humbling to take a look at what you have accomplished in your time on this planet. And I'm so thrilled that you could take the time to be here with us for me and my listeners to answer some questions about your personal journey with the Shakespeare Authorship Mystery and what it has meant for you and what your specific areas of knowledge, especially your knowledge of Greek language, of course, and the way that you have taught English and English literature to people around the world. I'd really like to know, and I'm sure my listeners would like to know, how that has played a part in your approach to Shakespeare and in your understanding of the Shakespeare Authorship Mystery.
Well, that's a very interesting question and quite an open-ended one, because I suppose my initial passion was Shakespeare before the teaching of the English language. What I really wanted to do career-wise was to do anything connected with Shakespeare, which is why I applied to the Shakespeare Institute in Birmingham way back in 1974 and did my MA there with Stanley Wells, the illustrious doyen, if you like, of Stratfordians, Sir Stanley Wells, as my tutor. And this was my plan, either to be an actor, and I tried a couple of times to take up acting professionally, or to become a lecturer in all things Shakespeare. It's what really turned me on. Speaking the lines, performing them, explaining them to students, and getting a great deal of satisfaction from making students feel that Shakespeare was not something intimidating, not something distant, but somebody whose writing was totally relevant to the present day, and who indeed deserves his unique position in world literature. Now, I didn't manage to spend my professional time doing theatre, and particularly Shakespeare. I did countless amateur performances from primary school to the present day. So I haven't missed out as much as I could have done on involvement in Shakespeare and in the theatre. But professionally, as you said, Stephen, I've spent most of my time teaching English as a second or foreign language, both in Europe and in other countries. And I've trained teachers to help them become more efficient in their teaching of English. And part of that, I should say, has been the role of literature. And in more recent years, the integration of performances of Shakespeare into language teaching. So I've been cooperating with various colleagues on what we call our English language voice theatre. And we've involved students as well. And some of the texts we chose were actually Shakespearean texts. And of course, that presented us with a challenge of how to present this incredibly subtle, rich, and complex language to students for whom English is not even a native language. And that's been a wonderful challenge. And it's been great hearing students, both from my days at the University of Thessaloniki in Greece, where they see me years later and say, Luke, Dr. Luke, or whatever they want to call me, you made Shakespeare so enjoyable. You made it, instead of one of the most difficult and frightening subjects, one of the most popular. So it's very gratifying that they remember our sessions on Othello, on Romeo and Juliet, and so on with affection. So that, I suppose, has been my aim in life, particularly my professional life, to drag Shakespeare into everything. And of course, we're here on a podcast which focuses on the authorship. And I don't know if you want me to say anything about how, in being involved in language teaching and theatre in education, how I came to have this insatiable interest in the authorship question.
Well, for many of us,
whether you would like to comment.
For many of us, it becomes some sort of a gateway that we came across in our love for Shakespeare. We found either a book about the authorship that we first read, or we met somebody who introduced us to the subject, or we just started asking our own questions because our rational minds said the brilliance of this just doesn't make sense when you tie it to this traditional biography of this country guy from Stratford.
Yes.
And, but those of us, and I'm obviously not anywhere near your level of teaching, but I do teach Shakespeare to young people. In fact, I'm teaching Macbeth right now to my students.
Yeah.
And you find that, where I come from, being the host of this podcast series and being a very well-known and upfront, out-forward Oxfordian, you find that colleagues sometimes will look at you a little askance, with a raised eyebrow. There's some whispers that happen here or there. And so I always ask people who are in that field of education in any way, what kind of response they receive from both their colleagues and their students when authorship becomes an issue.
Yes. Right. Well, we'll get to that right away. But before I fell off my donkey on the way to Damascus or whatever it is, before that moment of epiphany, which I'll tell you about in just a minute, I was teaching Shakespeare year after year to university students. And of course, I would mention the biography, inevitably his life, the man from Stratford, would make an appearance before we got down to analysing the texts. And by then, Stephen, I'm talking now about the late 70s, early 80s, I'd already read at least a dozen of standard biographies. And I regurgitated much of what I had read, in brief, of course, to my students. But even when I was reading them, and even more so when I was testing what I had read with, if you like, neutral observers, the students, my heart sank. I used to have this uncomfortable feeling long before I became an authorship questioner. I had this feeling that this life was utterly dull, utterly unconvincing, and virtually non-existent. And it was such a sharp contrast to the magic of the texts, the richness of the texts, and even one's intuition about what these texts were really about. I hadn't yet articulated consciously what was wrong with these two strands, the life, of which I had read all the classic mainstream biographies, going way back to Dowden in the 19th century, the late Victorian biographer, who focused very much on the texts as a mirror of Shakespeare's life, right up to the present day, to Stephen Greenblatt and Will in the World and so on. So I read dozens of these, and none of them matched the magic of the text. So there was a mismatch. Something was rotten in the state of Shakespeare studies. And this, of course, was confirmed when I went to the Shakespeare Institute in 1974. It was a pretty dull experience, actually. It was fairly mainstream academic. I enjoyed it, but it was a difficult year for me, what with the invasion of the island on which I was born. So my mind was on other things, and Shakespeare was the last thing on my mind. But I did intend to do a PhD on Shakespeare. I never got around to it, but my skepticism, if you like, the seeds had been planted. And it was this mismatch between the life and the work. So my epiphany wasn't somebody speaking to me. It was walking into a big bookshop in London called Foyles. And whenever I went to London, because as you said, I grew up in Birmingham, whenever I went to London to see friends, I'd pop into the bookstores and see what was new in the Shakespeare department, and I would buy yet another biography. So there I was, browsing the shelves there, and my hands fell on something called the mysterious William Shakespeare. And I didn't realize this was actually completely unorthodox. I looked at the blurb on the back, and it was all completely new to me. This idea by Charlton Ogburn that, somebody else had written the plays. It somehow clicked, and it aroused my curiosity because, as I've said to you, I was already becoming a Protestant, if you like, in a Catholic world. I was already beginning
I like that analogy.
To question
that's a good analogy.
Well, thanks. It was kind of this sudden questioning of God, questioning of the intermediaries between us and the truth, if you like. And these intermediaries had let us down. I felt pretty badly. And when I read Charlton Ogburn, Stephen, and I need to say this, I thought the book was absolutely brilliant. I mean, I wasn't a beginner. I mean, I'd studied Shakespeare from the age of 15. I was now an adult. And this guy had such a beautiful way of writing. For one thing, he wrote eloquently, with passion, with empirical references on every page, which was so refreshing. When you looked at the mainstream biographies, and you know as well as I do, that 5% of those volumes are fact, and 95% is basically, between you and me, bullshit. It's made up, and they admit it now quite openly. And Greenblatt is one recent author who openly admits and even revels in the fact that you make it up. If the evidence isn't there, you make it up. So you make your own will in the world, as you make your own way in the world of Shakespeare. So Ogburn, for me, was a breath of fresh air. But above all, it sounded convincing. Things fell into place. I mean, I was a scholar, if you like, on a small scale. I liked to see facts, history, and language and literature combined. I liked the way all these strands in Charlton Ogburn's book suddenly came together. I wasn't converted overnight by any means. But what it did, Stephen, and still does, is make me question. And it's made me utterly convinced that the only way to be is a questioner. And anybody who discourages us from questioning, I think is doing us a disservice, is doing Shakespeare a disservice. Because I think the name of the game, as you say on your program, let's go ask some questions. And
well, you're definitely singing our tune here at the Quiller Nation. There's no doubt about that. And that is a common and very reoccurring theme of the program, as you mentioned. And I'm glad to hear you say that.
Listen,
what I'd like to know is your particular upbringing, being Greek in origin and then studying English and Greek, and that having that sort of background that most of us do not have. as well as your specialty in teaching English to foreign language speakers, do you feel that that played any specific role in your approach to the Shakespeare Authorship Mystery in a way that would be different than, say, somebody like me who has, was born and raised in the U.S. and speaks only one language?
Yeah.
And, tell me about how your particular background has influenced your approach to this issue.
Yeah. Okay, my background in language and education. I have a passion, if you like, for education. I have a passion for making students believe that education has something to offer them and can be a transformative experience. And that language and literature are there for the taking, and they are ways in which my learners can develop themselves personally and their place in the world, and to make the most of that place in the world. Now, the last thing I ever wanted was for language or literature to be distant and alien to my students. The authorship question makes the whole thing so exciting. You can make Shakespeare exciting without even mentioning, of course, the authorship issue or even the life of the man, whoever he was. And that, of course, is how I was trained at university. We were trained in the so-called school of practical criticism. And if you know what that means, Stephen, perhaps your listeners would like to know what we were encouraged to do in my time at Bristol University in studying literature. To put it in a nutshell, you focused on the text and only the text. The words on the page. You ignored history, and of course, biography was anathema. And that's fine. You could still make it exciting, as I said. But what the Oxfordians did for me, and then, of course, I read lots of other unorthodox views and all the other candidates, what they all have in common is that, well, one thing, there are many things they have in common, is that they're all exciting. They're exciting because they make connections between the world and Shakespeare, between politics, between history, religion, you name it, and what we have studied on the page. And this, for me, breathes life into the text. It breathes life into the world of Shakespeare. And you don't see him, if you like, on a formalistic basis, and you don't indulge in over universal views of this man's genius. It becomes much more concrete. He becomes, if you like, rooted in the context of his time. He becomes a real three-dimensional human being, engaging with his world, engaging with particular people, particular institutions, and massive historical changes. This is exciting, you see, and this is what I think asking these questions brings into the teaching of Shakespeare.
I absolutely 100% agree with that. And I share that with students when the topic comes up. I specifically share that with actors. And I find, and even though there are some very famous actors, including I have a recent episode with Sir Derek Jacobi, who, in his opinion, the author doesn't matter. Yep. Which I disagree with, and Derek and I will agree to disagree on this. I believe the author absolutely matters, and I have a great number of actors that I have worked with who agree that the author absolutely matters, and that you wouldn't do Tennessee Williams and not want to know about the life of Tennessee Williams and let it inform you about the characters he has created. And I think that it's very much the same when it comes to Shakespeare. When you know Edward de Vere's life and you see his life being poured out for you on the page through these characters, I think it brings a layer of depth to performance that you cannot achieve in any other way.
Well, I heard the podcast with Derek Jacobi and Richard Clifford. And of course, I've heard many other people and my friends too. Many colleagues and friends, when we talk about these things, they always end up with this, it's the author is irrelevant. It's the text that matters. What does it matter? We have the plays, blah, blah, blah. This, of course, is a conditioned response. They may not realize it, but the very influential school of criticism, which I referred to as practical criticism, it was introduced by I. Richards and others, and has been incredibly influential, not only in the academy, but in society at large. So it's become a platitude to say, what does it matter who wrote the works, or even the context and the historical circumstances? The main thing is we have the text. And even 2 days ago, a very, very cultured and educated friend of mine, who is a poet and loves his Shakespeare as much as I do, said exactly the same thing. He's actually attended my webinar, and we share a lot in common, concerning literature. But at the end of the day, even if they're excited by what you tell them concerning Edward de Vere or any other issues related to the authorship question, they do come up with this, what does it matter? And it seems to me outrageous. If you said, we don't know Beethoven, we only know his work, and it doesn't matter who Beethoven was. It's purely, that's a formalistic approach. In effect, that's what it is. It's saying Beethoven did not belong to a particular place and time. And we all know the influence of Napoleon, the French Revolution, and so on. In cases such as that, Stephen, nobody objects to making the connection. And I've read biographies of Beethoven. None of them are as impoverished as the Shakespeare biographies are. They all in some way connect Beethoven's life, the history of his time, with the works we have. And of course, you can listen to the works purely formalistically. That's fine. It's up to the individual to do so if they wish. But Shakespeare is unique. He's unique in that he is the greatest in his field, and he's the least known in his field. Although most has been written about him than any other actual human being. In fact, we could say in the whole of history, more has been written about this individual than anybody you can care to mention, from the ancient Greeks to the present. And we know less about him than anybody else of that stature. It's a fascinating paradox that should make people think. But you know what I mean. Anyway, do stop me if I get carried away.
Not at all. No, exactly. And, I think most of my listeners are in that same camp, and they agree with us on that topic. And I think one of the keys that, in speaking for them right now as their representative in talking to you, I think one of the keys that they would like to know from someone of your education and background is the difficulties that you run into when it comes to sharing these thoughts and ideas with others, whether it be students or colleagues, and how your particular background maybe opens different doors to aspects of the authorship and aspects of Edward de Vere's nameplate on the works that others of us really don't see as clearly, because we don't speak Greek or read Greek, and we don't have that context. And I think, for one of the things, a friend of mine once said to me, the beauty of Greek is that there are 15 different words for love, and English has one.
Yeah. Yes.
Like those types of layers are things that English only speakers, I don't think, can really grasp on how translation is necessary in the brain, let alone on the page, and how the writer of these works had to have had that kind of similar knowledge.
Yeah, right. Well, the Greek strand is definitely one aspect of the debate. And indeed, I have a brand new book on my desk at the moment, which I've started reading, which is called Greek Tragic Women on Shakespearean Stages. And what the author Tanya Pollard argues is that Shakespeare and his contemporaries were in fact familiar either through Latin or the Greek original with particularly Euripides and certain of his heroines. And the author demonstrates this with references to Hamlet and Hecuba and so on. So one argument that we can bring forward, and Greek is, as I said, only one dimension, is when discussing this with educated and, if you like, well-meaning colleagues and friends, is to try and approach it empirically, to try and ask questions based on as much factual information as possible. So what you do, because I know that the kind of response you're referring to, we often get a very hostile reaction, almost aggressive, from friends and colleagues. If you persist in arguing that the authorship question is one worth pursuing, and even if you go further and suggest an alternative author, you make yourself very unpopular. And people do become contemptuous, they become aggressive, they become irrational. And so how do you deal with that? Well, I don't always succeed. We usually end up by agreeing to disagree. In some cases, one eventually gets through to them. I'll give you one example. My English teacher at school, who made me love Shakespeare, is now a very good friend of mine. He's in his 80s now, and I've known him for over 50 years. And he, at school, taught us to love Shakespeare through our study of The Tempest and of Othello, which we were doing for our, A-levels, as we call them in the UK. Now, John has listened to me ever since I read Charlton Ogmore, engaging the group, our friends, when we're drinking, having our pint, on the issue of the authorship. And the reaction would be very dismissive, almost contemptuous. And I would stop. I didn't want to lose a very good friend, and we agreed to disagree, as I said. As the years went by, though, Steve, and I learned more and more about the actual reasons why people believe in Edward de Vere as a very plausible author of the plays, the more I knew. Like, I got Roger Stritmatter's PhD. I got a copy of it years ago from Roger himself. And I have a cousin in the United States who managed to get hold of it for me. So I knew about the Geneva Bible, but many, many other things, the kind of books that de Vere read, I was familiar with the way they matched many of the books that we've always agreed feed into the 37 or 40 Shakespeare texts. So what you would do is you would say, well, how do you explain this? How do you explain the fact that the person who wrote Love's Labour's Lost? And I'll give them a concrete example. I'll say your standard Arden edition of the play, which is a mainstream Stratfordian academic position, says that whoever wrote this play, Love's Labour's Lost, was familiar with a manuscript written by Sidney. It hadn't been published at the time. It was only available in manuscript, and that somehow Shakespeare got hold of it and incorporated it into the writing of Love's Labour's Lost. And indeed, the same Arden edition of the play Love's Labour's Lost, I would argue with my friends, informs us this is not an Oxfordian speaking. It's a mainstream scholar saying that Love's Labour's Lost is somehow based on the lifestyle and the life and times of Sir Philip Sidney and his circle, that particular coterie. And I would say, well, how do you explain this? How would the man from Stratford, if this is true, and this is not an Oxfordian? So you use arguments from their camp, from the mainstream scholarship camp, to bolster your own questioning, if you see what I mean. So the more you refer to your knowledge and you say, how does my knowledge help? My knowledge, if you like, what there is of it, helps in that I can not quote the Oxfordian point of view, but I'll take a mainstream point of view and I'll marry it with my skepticism. So there are so many examples of this. And you look at, the whole story of Henry IV, Prince Howell and the robbery on Gad's Hill, the Hamlet thing about the pirates and the fact that Hamlet was stripped by pirates and so on. And the same thing happens to Edward de Vere. How do you explain these coincidences? And aren't you interested in these coincidences? They are fascinating. I would have thought for anybody in the mainstream simply because they have such a close connection with the works that we all love so much. And they're telling us something, and we don't take up the trail because, of course, it leads away from the man from Stratford and towards another potential author. So you see, this, what I do try to do whenever I can is quote a mainstream perspective and the bibliography, if you like, I mean, the wide reading that has emerged, that, you know, the scholars have uncovered that the author of these plays had read X, Y, and Z. And it goes on and on. The list goes on and on. And then you say, well, let's look at the will. Let's take a fairly conventional document. You look at the will, and what evidence, you ask, is there in William of Stratford's will that he even owned a single book, or that he was a writer, you know, this kind of thing. So, well, have you ever read the will? Have a look at it. It's not very long. And what is remarkable about it, it's got everything in it to do with, you name it, but nothing to do with the world of books and the world of writing. No people, no documents, no objects whatsoever. And this begins to make them doubt. You see, you plant the seed and then you add to it. You say, what about the signatures? Let's look at have you looked at the 6 signatures? Isn't there something odd about them? You see what I'm getting at? You try and get them thinking empirically, get them thinking factually, and identifying inconsistencies and contradictions.
Now,
and
you have a webinar
examples
that you put together that you have presented multiple times.
Yeah.
In fact, I think last spring you presented it, and then I noticed when you put it up again, you actually made the comment that you were bringing it back by, quote, unpopular demand, which bespeaks that there was some, resistance to the reception of it. Are these some of the things you just were talking about? Are these some of the aspects of your webinar that you include in your presentation? And how did that webinar come to be, and what else does it cover?
Well, it was actually not by popular demand, but friends said, look, whenever I talked about it with people who'd never heard of the authorship question, they would kind of pause, their mouths would drop. They would look at me and say, wow, why don't you do a webinar on this? This is amazing. I say, well, I don't know. A lot of people just don't take it seriously. But Stephen, they always seem to find me very persuasive. Well, after all, my mother did want me to become a lawyer, and I never did.
Mine too.
Lawyer, but I'm told
there's another thing we have. We have a lot of things in common, including teaching theater and our love for Shakespeare.
Yeah.
But my mother wanted me to become a lawyer too. She was very supportive of me being an actor, but she truly wanted me to be a lawyer.
Well, exactly. So anyway, I do like, if you like, rhetoric. I like arguing, and I love to marshal my facts and try and persuade people, and it seemed to work. So people who were not on my side, if you like, or were completely innocent of the issue would say, well, why don't you share this with people? Why don't you write an article? Why don't you do a webinar? So I did. And we got 100 or so people the first time. We repeated it. Most of the people who came were actually positive. I think they were all positive. In fact, those who know me from the social media just didn't bother to turn up. But they would either be contemptuous or laugh that this was some kind of ridiculous flat earth, this reaction. Or they would say, Luke, let's agree to disagree. We'll have a drink about it sometime. But because they know I'm not crazy, that I love my Shakespeare, and I've studied my Shakespeare, and I've performed my Shakespeare, they perhaps think, well, perhaps there's something in it. We know this guy. He's not normally completely irrational. So what I did when I did the webinar, Stephen, I focused very specifically on 10 questions. It was one question, and they were all empirical in nature. What I mean by that is I would get them to look at evidence and ponder the evidence, beginning with the will and going up to the Robert Greene document, the upstart crow, of course, and I would include the ever-living poet. And because I'm a linguist and a teacher of language, I would say, well, let's, for example, ever-living. What do you think ever-living might mean? So they would give me their answers, just as I would elicit, in other words. I wouldn't feed them my answer. I'd let them discover. Then I would say, well, let's look at the sonnets.
How very Socratic of
the preface to the
you Greek master.
Well, it is
you.
a kind of an answer. You're teasing out the answers, and it worked similarly with the 6 signatures. I said to them, I don't know if you were at the webinar, I said, can you please take a piece of paper and write your signature 2 times, 3 times, as many times as you like. Have a good look at those signatures. I said, do you notice anything about them? Are they the same? Are they different? They would say, well, they're more or less the same. I said, mine are too. My signature. Ever since, I don't know, for years and years now, since I was a young man until the present day, my signature looks more or less the same as it always has done. I have one and only one signature. It's a kind of fingerprint. Then I say, well, let's look at Shakespeare's 6 signatures. Have a look at these. These are the only written examples of his writing, virtually, that we have. Do you notice anything about them? And I say, well, they're all different. I said, exactly. Yours are all the same. Mine are the same. But here's the greatest writer in the English language. And they're all different, and they're almost illegible. Just look at them. What a mess. Was he sick? Did he have some kind of neurological condition? I don't know. But it's odd, isn't it? And you plant 10 questions like this. One of my favorites is Corambis. Corambis meaning, the original name of Polonius. In the early, I think it's in the Bad Quarto, we have not Polonius, but somebody called Corambis. So, well, who's Corambis when he's around? Well, it's the name that Shakespeare originally chose for the guy who became Polonius. I said, well, why do you think he chose Corambis? Let's have a look. What does it mean? So we did a bit of Latin. Okay, something like two-hearted, something like two-faced, somebody unreliable, dishonest, whatever. And then you say, well, actually, this is connected to Burleigh, Cecil, the most powerful man in the kingdom at the time of Elizabeth. He was, the prime minister. He was a big shot. And that was his family motto. It was based on, that wasn't his. His was that there was only one face, some words to that effect. And what Shakespeare did, whoever he was, he made the one face into two-faced. So he's saying this guy, Polonius, as he came to be called, is somebody not to be trusted, is a hypocrite. And then he has us see him being stabbed behind the arras. If this is a portrait, I said, of the most powerful man in the kingdom, and Shakespeare puts him on stage and ridicules him and has him stabbed behind the arras and shows him as a prattling fool. And also we have the evidence. I say, look at the speech that Polonius makes to his son Laertes as he's going off to study, right? To Paris, I think. And then look at this. And I show them the letter, the speech that Burleigh himself made to his son in similar circumstances. And you may know this, Stephen, that the two are very similar. What Polonius says.
Yes, and at the De Vere Society event that I attended at Hatfield House in October 2022, they pointed that out quite clearly and demonstrated the evidence of Burleigh's motto and how it was corrupted into Corambis. They even explained how the name Polonius was used as a substitute and where that origin probably came from, as well as then delivered. It was Sir Derek, who delivered the piece from Hamlet, and then it was Richard Clifford who read aloud the precepts of Lord Burleigh. It was a wonderful comparison to see there personified, dramatized in front of the audience, and undeniable connection.
Yes, it is incredibly convincing. And you say, well, would William of Stratford ever dare to put Polonius, to put Burleigh on stage, to ridicule him in the way he did, and get away with it? And how did he ever manage to get away? Who could possibly have done that and got away with it. But it's not just one argument, it's a multi-pronged argument. So you pile doubt upon doubt, from the signatures to the will, and the upstart crow stories say, well, let's look at what Robert Greene says. And let's look at the famous apology of Henry Chettle, which in fact is not an apology. This I find one of the most disturbing of contradictions in the whole mainstream approach to Shakespeare. And I taught this. What makes me a little bit angry is that I swallowed all this, and I would regurgitate to my students that Robert Greene and the university wits were jealous of this upstart from Stratford because he was out doing them at their own game. And Robert Greene warned the playwrights in the pamphlet. Let's call it the Upstart Crow for short. And then, of course, after Robert Greene's death, we are told, and Robert Greene, remember, has accused this Shakespeare scene, as he calls him, from Stratford. He's accusing him of being a crook, a con man, a plagiarist, a moneylender who squeezes the playwrights for all the money he can get. And he paints a pretty bleak picture of who this guy was. And he tells the other playwrights, who are probably Christopher Marlowe, Thomas Nash, and George Peele, he tells them to keep away from him and never let him get anywhere near their play scripts again. And then the crucial issue is this, Stephen. We have the second document by Henry Chettle, and we are told that in this, he mentions what Robert Greene had done in warning the playwrights about the man Shakespeare. And then, though, he says that one of these people that he addressed this document to, he doesn't care much for. The other one, he says, is a fine, upstanding chap and diverse of worship. In other words, important people have sprung to his defense. And he says, I apologize if I've offended this person. And Stratfordians have said that this is a rich apology to William of Stratford for the attack that Robert Greene made on him, which is absolute nonsense. And if you read the text, Henry Chettle's text, it's quite clear. And Sir Jonathan Bates, who's a mainstream scholar, has actually had the honesty to admit that the apology that Chettle makes is not to Shakespeare at all, but to one of the three original playwrights who were the victims of this con man. So the con man, Stephen, remains a con man. We are told right at the beginning of his career, in 1592, that this man from Stratford is a crook. He's, poet 8. And then we get Ben Jonson's poem on poet 8. And it reinforces, it echoes what Robert Greene said. And you think, well, it sounds like they're talking about the same person. And you get this profile emerging of this man from Stratford, who was a businessman and a guy not to be trusted, a plagiarist. And who is saying this? Not me. It's Robert Greene. It's not only Robert Greene, it's Ben Jonson as well, who's supposed to know all these people and who actually had a hand in the first folio. So what is going on here? You see what I mean?
Absolutely.
So this apology is actually non-existent. And a lot of people don't realize you still get a lot of books coming out, and even the Encyclopedia Britannica says there is a famous apology to the man from Stratford, which is absolute nonsense. It's in plain English. If you can read English, you read this very carefully. He's talking about three playwrights who are the victims of this con man, who is called Shakespeare. And he apologizes to one of those three playwrights, not to Shakespeare. Shakespeare is still the crook he was in the Robert Greene pamphlet. So what I'm saying is we are being told from the beginning of this man's career that there's something rotten in the official narrative, that there is not a smoking gun, but there is smoke. There is no smoke without fire. The smoke is that his contemporaries are talking very explicitly about someone called Shakespeare, who's a crook, who is not to be trusted. And what does he do? He takes other people's manuscripts and he claims them for his own. And we see this then in lots of other ways. And if you look more closely, it's not true to say there is no evidence that anybody doubted that the man from Stratford was the author. This is not true either. They say there isn't any evidence. Of course there is. There's all those apocryphal texts, which we know are not from the pen of the great Shakespeare himself, which have W.S. or by William Shakespeare on the cover. You know, there's about half a dozen of them, the so-called apocryphal plays, the London Prodigal and so on. Say, well, so there is something going on here. There's a process, not a plot. You don't talk about plot. You're looking at evidence. And you say, how come Shakespeare put his name on these texts which he did not write according to mainstream scholarship? I'm not saying it. It's the mainstream scholars who tell you Shakespeare did not write the London Prodigal and so on, and Yorkshire Tragedy. You see what I mean? So you take their own words and you point out the inconsistencies and the contradictions.
Well, so one of the big debates of the Shakespeare Authorship Mystery that I think a lot of people ask this question, and I don't know that there's been a definitive answer, and I myself am not sure where I fully stand. Sometimes I feel like I lean one way and then I hear something or read something and I'd lean the other way, is whether or not the man from Stratford actually knew he was going to go down in history as William Shakespeare, the writer, and how much of a role he did or did not play in this great ruse that has been foisted upon us. Where do you stand, and do you address that in your webinar? Do you believe he was a front man who knew what was happening? Was it coincidental? Where do you stand on that topic?
Yeah. Well, this is part 2, you see. I've been asked to do part 2 and part 3. The part 2 would be, well, they said, well, tell us who did, in your opinion, write the plays. Because the webinar, Stephen, focuses completely on raising questions. And as I say, it's very much in the spirit of your podcast. We're asking questions. Part 2, which I haven't written yet, will argue the case for the man from Stratford. I know what I'm going to say. There are, again, I could make 10 arguments, be devil's advocate, if you like, for the other side, the side I grew up with. And I'll say, well, these are the things that make me doubt, that make me actually believe that the man from Stratford may indeed, unlikely though it seems, end up being the most likely of the candidates for the authorship. And so we'll call that part 2. Then part 3, we'll look at Edward de Vere. We'll look at the other strong candidates. But, you know, one thing, it doesn't worry me really whether we find the answer right now. It'd be wonderful to find it, the smoking gun. What I am fascinated by is that all the questions we ask, all the trails we open up by questioning, they all lead in one general direction. None of them that I can see, none of the evidence which has come up, let's call it circumstantial evidence, none of it points back to Stratford. Everything you can possibly read, both in the mainstream scholarship material and in the Oxfordian and other, alternative authorship writing, it all points in one direction. Do you know which direction I mean? Everything which comes up as smoke points in the direction of the court. What strikes me is that everything I read from both sides and serious scholarship, I'll give you one example from mainstream scholarship, which I was very impressed by. I think it's Richard Dutton. Dutton wrote a book called Shakespeare Court Playwright. It's quite a new book, and it's mainstream. It's a Stratfordian text. But what the guy does, very convincingly, is argue that most of the plays originated in a court performance, that they're rooted in the life of the court. And performance in the public theatres and later the Globe came afterwards. And that's
I absolutely agree with that. And I think I think there's such a strong case for that. I think that's undeniable.
You and I, we can agree. Yeah, if you and I say, well, I think this, they say, well, we know you would say that, wouldn't you? Because you're who you are and you're a skeptic. You don't believe in the religion anymore. You're fallen from grace. But when you say Richard Dutton, who's a highly regarded, university professor and has written tons of books on Shakespeare, has never questioned the authorship. You know what William Blake said about John Milton? He said he's of the devil's party without knowing it. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
I love William Blake. And Blake he questioned a lot. And he says of Milton and his Paradise Lost that he's on the side of the devil without knowing it. Because, when he sings the songs of the villain, the Iago figure, who of course is Satan in Paradise Lost, he's much more convincing than when he's praising God. So it's a great, great, great point of view by Blake. But what I'm saying is you get a scholar like Catherine Duncan-Jones, or this guy Richard Dutton that I mentioned. Catherine Duncan-Jones wrote The Ungentle Shakespeare, and she wrote a second biography called Upstart Crow. Don't know if you've read them, but both of them mainstream. And her mother was a great, mainstream scholar, a Stratfordian, if you like. But she's a scholar, and scholars, when they do their job, Stephen, try to tell the truth. They try to be honest, and that's the way they should be. And Catherine Duncan-Jones is a good enough scholar that when she writes her Ungentle Shakespeare, what you get is a portrait of a guy who is so inconsistent, so implausible as the author of As You Like It, as the author of King Lear, that you say, thank you very much, Catherine Duncan-Jones. You've given me so much ammunition to undermine the position that this man could possibly, this crook that you describe, that's why she calls it the ungentle Shakespeare. It's not the mild-mannered guy who important people rush to defend, according to the Robert Greene, pamphlet. It's on the contrary. It's a portrait of a guy who's pretty seedy and pretty unpleasant. And she says he's an unpleasant guy and may even be involved in the brothel business with his mate, George, the one, Wilkins, the one who wrote supposedly Pericles with him. So when she says things like this, that he was involved perhaps with Wilkins in prostitution, you think, well, and money lending. And he was a user, and not just a money lender. He wasn't a respectable banker. He was a Shylock. How could he then write Shylock? How could he then write Portrait of Portia in The Merchant of Venice if he himself was actually the stingy old bugger that Catherine Duncan-Jones presents for us?
I think some of these modern scholars who you mentioned, like Catherine Duncan-Jones and Richard Dutton and others, I think what we're starting to see here is that there are closet skeptics in the mainstream academia, and they just don't know how to come out of the closet for fear of what kind of scorn and attack they will receive. And I think that they may even have their own internal secret strategies for eking out details a little at a time to help the paradigm shift, but that they're not going to be a part of the wave. You know what I mean?
That's a very good question, and I wonder about that myself, and I wonder whether we'll see a day when one of these scholars will come out and just bring the whole edifice crashing down by saying, I have a confession to make. I no longer believe that the man from Stratford wrote the plays. I would love to see that. I'm not sure we will. I was going to say something else, though, what was important. What we are getting, academics, though, there are more and more young academics who are, attached to universities. And we know there has been already a postgraduate course at a respectable English university in London about authorship studies. It's becoming respectable. it's becoming respectable to question, I think. And any scholar worth their salt will be proud to say, I'm open-minded and I'm questioning. But what I'm saying about these scholars is that even if they don't doubt, because people don't find it easy to question, it's like the monarchy, Stephen, that we've seen a lot of recently in the UK, following the death of Queen Elizabeth II and following the TV series, The Crown. And you wonder why the British are so attached to the monarchy. And there's a parallel question one may ask, why are people so attached to the idea of Shakespeare as the man from Stratford? And my feeling is that it's very much something to do with how they see their identity as what it means to be British. That this is something, whether conscious or unconscious, that people identify very closely with Britishness. The Queen is one thing, or at least the late Queen was. I don't know how Charles is going to manage to maintain this mythology, but Shakespeare has become a kind of mythology of Britishness, and it's part of what we get taught at school. You know, the young lad who left Stratford and did well, a bit like Dick Whittington, you know, who left his village and he went to London and he became, you know, the mayor of London. I think it's that kind of, you know, story which helps shape one's identity.
Well, there certainly are some really interesting parallels there when you mention, you know, the monarchy and the belief in the man from Stratford, and you used the word mythology. And you're right. And I know some Brits who get very offended when you talk about the monarchy in any way whatsoever that might question it or disparage it. But the question I always ask is, isn't it based in the idea that this particular family has better DNA than anyone else on the planet, and that's why they deserve to rule, and that DNA was given them specifically, graced by God? And isn't that mythology? And doesn't that sound crazy when you say it out loud, that this human being is so far superior to the rest of us because of his birthright? Haven't we outgrown that as a planet? I would think we have, but apparently we haven't.
Well, as I say, the explanation is to do with nation building. And we see this, I mean, I live in Greece at the moment, and one could say the same thing about Greek national consciousness and any national consciousness. We have our mythologies. You have it with George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and so on. And then you get the skeptics and say, now, wait a minute. Well, let's look at Thomas Jefferson. Was he such a good guy after all? And people talk about slavery and so on. So I'm saying that there is a myth which is a necessary myth when you're building a nation. And I'm sure the Ukraine now today, we could talk about how important it is for the people of Ukraine to distinguish themselves from the Russians. I don't know. And to build a nation which has its own characteristics, its own history, its own symbols. And much of that can be irrational. Our attachment to our symbols, our national symbols, is not necessarily logical, just like faith isn't built on reason either. But it's important to people's sense of identity. And you just often cannot approach it on a rational basis. So we could argue till the cows come about how implausible the Stratford narrative is. And I could go on, as you've probably guessed, at some length about why I find it. And I love Shakespeare. Nobody can accuse me of not loving Shakespeare. And I think the same applies to you. And I am not a snob. If you like, I even despise the aristocracy. Because what they say about skeptics is that we believe in a snobbish way that only an aristocrat could write like the angel that wrote these plays, which is absolute nonsense. I don't think Mark Rylance is a snob. I don't think Derek Jacobi is a snob. And I certainly am not. I'm working class. That's my background. And I would love the myth to be true, if anything. But I actually think it's irrelevant. It's neither here nor there, whether he was a poor boy made good or whether he was an aristocrat. Some aristocrats were wonderful artists. We all know that. And the court in European history has produced, a lot of musical masterpieces, paintings, and so on. The actual creators of those paintings and that music may or may not have been aristocrats. But you see, in the end, we're talking about how analytic you can be, how appropriate it is to analyze this myth, which has built up since the 18th century, really since David Garrick, that Shakespeare is some kind of god. And the metaphor of God and the genius metaphor as well, that the man is the embodiment of genius. All of these things discourage questioning. And in a sense, the Romantics have a lot to answer for.
Well, Garrick was like a P.T. Barnum, Garrick was like the P.T. Barnum of his age, and, talk about opportunist and, fellow actor. So I give him credit for that. And apparently a very decent one to some degree. But, he was looking to make a buck. He was looking to make a quick buck. And he would have easily said there's a sucker born every minute. And he turned everyone into suckers by turning Stratford into an amusement park location that still holds true to this day.
Okay, he did that. Now, when we move on a little bit to the Romantics, we cannot say of Coleridge and Keats and the rest of them that they were the kind of cynical businessmen or impresarios out to make a fast buck. With them, Stephen, we need to look elsewhere for why they deified Shakespeare as the ultimate expression of literary genius. And Keats above all, but Coleridge too. And they have something in common. And it's come down to us to the 21st and the 20th century, of course. What I mean is their view of genius depends very much on us not knowing who the guy was. And in fact, on the mismatch between the humdrumness of his life in comparison with the myriad-minded genius, the divine gift he had for creating numerous characters who have no resemblance whatsoever. Anything we can imagine about him. And it's on the basis of this contradiction that Keats talks about negative capability. And Coleridge talks about the imaginative genius of Shakespeare, who can embody others, the other, without himself in any way interfering. His own personality is invisible. It's just not there. And that's true. It's a historical fact that the guy is silent, he's invisible. And this has spawned a particular view of genius. And this brings us to why the authorship question is important. It's important to how the theory of Shakespeare's genius, which is a product of our not knowing much about his experience of real life. And therefore we say, well, inspiration, we don't know where it comes from. It's a mysterious divine force which generates Hamlet and Othello and Portia and Rosalind and so on. Say, well, where does he get it all from? Keats tells us it's negative capability. He obliterates himself and becomes Desdemona. He becomes Rosalind and Portia. And this is the theory, I think, and it's a particularly romantic theory. And I love my Keats, and I know why Keats says it. And Coleridge, wonderful theory of literature. And then T.S. Eliot picks this up in the 20th century, as does James Joyce, the invisibility and the impersonality of the author. You look at the text, not the context. So we are discouraged, in a nutshell, Stephen, from looking at the historical circumstances of these great plays and poems.
As an educator, though, and myself as an educator, and I have friends and colleagues who are educators who are also skeptics. Don't you feel, and they believe, and I believe, that the Stratford myth is actually damaging to learners because it is not explainable, and it discourages the idea that it requires hard work and rigorous study in order to be such a genius, that you cannot just be magically touched by God and become the greatest writer of all time. You have to work hard, you have to learn, you have to study, you have to practice. Right, yeah. And in order to become a virtuoso of anything, it requires thousands of hours of commitment to make it happen.
Yes, and it does. Again, we would go to any research there is available on what is genius, what is intelligence, what is creativity. And I think if we have the scholars on our side, it helps us to make the case that you just outlined, which is that experience does play a part in creativity and the end product, and transforming that experience through hard work, through perspiration as well as inspiration, is an essential component in the description of what these talented people are and how they're different from you and me. And what we have got with Shakespeare is a theory which contradicts in a most implausible manner any serious theory of what genius or intelligence is. You know, that it drops out of the sky like Caliban's music, you know, out of nowhere. This beautiful music, you know, appears in this imminent, mysterious way, and nobody can explain it. And that is because with Shakespeare, indeed, we don't know anything about the man. And when they do, when Keats looks at his life and says, well, how could this man from this particular background, this is not to do with snobbery, it's to do with experience, how could he possibly create Hamlet? I mean, how could he write about Rosalind? I mean, his children couldn't write. And even Stratfordians admit that his daughters could not write their names. And his wife probably could not write either. Neither could his dad. And how could he possibly then sit down and create Rosalind and Cleopatra and Viola and all these wonderful characters, even right from the beginning, from the Comedy of Errors? You've got these women. We mentioned Shakespeare's unruly women at the beginning. And one of the things that made me wonder is, I've heard you say in your podcasts over the years I've been listening, that this guy was a feminist. Am I right?
Yes, absolutely. I agree with that. Well, I fully agree with that. I believe he's one of the first feminist writers on record.
Absolutely. And I've heard you say this, and I thought, well, I must send him my Shakespeare's Unruly Women.
Please.
But I think you've got the message anyway already. What I do there is I take the women from the Comedy of Errors from very early on, Ariadne, whatever her name is, I think, and she says something like, why should their liberty than ours be more worth their effect? And right from the beginning, from the Comedy of Errors onwards, right to Cordelia and King Lear and the late plays, you know, and the female characters in The Winter's Tale and so on. This guy is standing up, maybe a woman for all I know. And as you know, there are theories which say it was the Countess of Pembroke. And now there's a new theory that it's Amelia Lanier, the Dark Lady, who has had a hand in the writing of these plays. We'll see. The jury is still out. But there is something curious about the conviction with which this author writes through women, not about them. He speaks through them as if he were a woman. And a lot of women say this. The speech that Emilia gives at the end of Othello, when she's talking to Desdemona and telling her that she's got the whole wrong approach to the men. And Othello and Iago, they're on one side. And we women, we have to learn to stand up for ourselves and to, you know, to treat them with the same medicine that they treat us when they're being unfair. And you remember that speech? I don't know that.
Yes, of course. And you know, I love the fact that you're talking about some of these, I don't know what I would say, lesser known female characters, but we often point to the Juliets and the Rosalinds and the Cleopatras. And we do forget that some of the other female characters, like the wives in Comedy of Errors, as you mentioned, Emilia in Desdemona, which is more of the soubrette role, right? The supporting female character role.
Yeah.
And then also when you go into even the Merry Wives of Windsor and what Mistress Ford and Mistress Page, their machinations and what they prevail upon Falstaff during that play. You're right. There are a lot of unruly women, and they're not just the leading characters and the major signature roles. It's almost every single character. Look at Maria in Twelfth Night, who comes upon and creates the conspiracy to drop the letter for Malvolio to find, and you could go on and on and on.
It's brilliant, and there's Sir Toby, of course, who says she's a beagle, true bred.
Yes,
and
right.
one that adores me. And they all admire the wonderful Maria.
He compares her to a character out of Greek mythology. I can't think of her name right now, but
Penthesilea.
Yes, Penthesilea. Correct. Yes.
He was one of the Amazons, and his joke is that she's very short. So Shakespeare must have had a short actor, because Hermia in Midsummer Night's Dream is short, whereas Helena is tall, remember? And Maria in Twelfth Night is short. So ironically, Sir Toby calls her an Amazon, who of course big women.
Right.
Penthesilea. He's pulling her leg. So this is the wonderful magic of Shakespeare. Whoever he or she or they were, there's something here. There's more to him or her than meets the eye. And I think to get to what it is, you do have to go back to the milieu, the artistic coterie of the time. And you look, I know you're an Oxfordian, and this podcast is dedicated to Oxford, I think. And there's something, which we need to say. What was I about to say about De Vere?
Well, yes, I am an Oxfordian, and the podcast is, but I'd say the podcast is more dedicated to the Shakespeare Authorship Mystery as a whole.
Yeah.
What my questions and answers have led me to believe is that the Earl of Oxford, at the very least, was the editor-in-chief of these great works. And I do believe that there were others who had a hand in it, and I believed he employed most of them at one time as his little writer's corps.
Exactly.
And so that's the position I take. But I also open up this podcast always and regularly to those who have other views and other candidates, and we always learn something new from every guest.
You do. And the important thing, as I said, for me, is that almost everything you learn, from whichever direction it comes, does point to an artistic coterie or a milieu, which is courtly. And a lot of these characters that crop up in the bibliography, they cluster around particular figures, I've noticed. And De Vere, I was going to say in his favor as a candidate, is definitely that so many of these characters, from Robert Greene to Watson to Lily, and so many of them seem to be part of his circle. And this, I would have thought, is something Stratfordians would be interested in, that there was an aristocrat, however antipathetic they find him. They clearly don't like Edward de Vere as a personality, as we know from the biography, Monstrous Adversary. It was a hatchet job. And but what I find fascinating, as if you're like an objective observer, is that a lot of the clues to who or why these texts were written, they go back, they find their way back to a circle, which is either the Sidney circle, the Countess of Pembroke circle, or De Vere's, or both, or the Earl of Leicester's. It seems a bit stubborn and, from a scholarly point of view, short-sighted to ignore these connections. How can you not be interested in the Geneva Bible, for example? And this wonderful coincidence that so many of the quotations highlighted by the owner of that book come up in Shakespeare. How can you not be curious to know more? And then you read about what books this guy ordered, and you see the list, and it's almost, the kind of thing you would expect Shakespeare to have read. And his connection with Montaigne and so on. And the other one, the Bedenfield, document. Cardenas Comfort, and so on. When you read these things, they all ring a bell, which is a Shakespearean bell, but they also cluster around somebody in the court. Edward de Vere, as we're talking about Oxford at the moment, so much of the evidence points back to him. It needs explaining, or at least, some kind of incorporating this data into our view of the whole picture. And to ignore it and say there is no authorship question seems to me very short-sighted and does the lovers of Shakespeare a disservice. And I would just like us all to have an open mind. And one day, if we discover that it was X, Y, or Z, so much the better. And even if we discover beyond a shadow of doubt that it was this guy from Stratford, I would say, great. Now we know. Now we can begin to, look at the plays in the same way as we've always done, or even change our view. But I don't think that's likely, because so much has been done in searching for information that would link the man from Stratford with the plays, and they've come up with nothing. This also puzzles me and it worries me. And I'm not the first to have said, well, we've got all these armies of scholars devoting hours of their professional lives trying to find one single connection, and they haven't managed to do it. So what we're left with, for me, Stephen, is the puzzle of two things for me. Is the first folio, it needs explaining. We need to explain why Ben Jonson says what he says, and is he saying what we think he says? And the other thing, again, it's Ben Jonson. And I think he's a key to this whole story. In his discoveries, or Timbers, his own, notebook, he again refers to the author, and it does seem to be that he's talking about the Stratford guy, or am I wrong? So those are the two, if you like, obstacles that I think we haven't managed as questioners or skeptics or believers in a different author. We haven't managed to explain satisfactorily, for me, why Ben Jonson did what he did in writing Sweet Swan of Avon and so on. And is he referring to that particular Avon? I know there have been attempts to explain, and they're very, interesting. And then there's what Jonson writes in his discoveries about the fact that this guy, wrote very fluently, and his sense of history wasn't very good. And he gives the example from Julius Caesar and so on. Is it talking about the guy from Stratford? Or is it possible, Stephen, that the guy from Stratford did write, but he didn't write the masterpieces that we know under the name of William Shakespeare? But what he did write were indeed the apocryphal plays. That's another possibility. The apocryphal plays all seem to have something in common. Perhaps this is a subject for another discussion, but there is a possible way of explaining and reconciling the contradictions, which has the mysterious William Shakespeare that we're all trying to find, and that the man from Stratford did write plays, but not the canon. He wrote the apocryphal plays. That's a possibility.
That's a very interesting idea. And I know that right now there are multiple scholars out there who have expressed a renewed interest in Jonson as the key to this mystery. And I know that there are some who are digging deep into that aspect of the mystery. And I think that we'll see some new revelations coming soon through their work. Speaking of work, though, I know that one of the things that my listeners are going to ask is they're going to say, well, where can I find this seminar on Shakespeare's Unruly Women? And how can I find this webinar on the Shakespeare Authorship Mystery that Dr. Luke has put together? And one of the things I note is that you're not really a YouTube guy. You don't have these up there on YouTube for people to view. These are things that they needed to attend to see. And I'm wondering, I'm guessing, and I could be wrong about this, but when you present your webinar, is it an open forum where people can ask questions in the chat or live, or how do you do that?
Yeah. Well, two things. I've done it twice. And on both occasions, I was told to record it. And I do have a YouTube channel, and some of my talks are there, but I don't think we recorded the webinar on Shakespeare. But I'm doing it again this at the end of November the 29th, I think, and it will be open. And then I'm doing it again locally for some students here in Greece. But the webinar on the 29th is open to anybody who is on Facebook or other social media. And I will try and record it this time and put it on my YouTube channel, which is, I think it's called something like Prodromou, a poetry performance or something.
By
And
the
if I
time
do
this
manage to record
episode
the Zoom-
airs, that date will have already passed. But what we will make sure is that the information is out there on our Patreon site for people to find it
Yes, and what I will
beforehand,
try to do is
and then they'll
record
be
it.
able to come and listen to this episode. But that's great to know. And I love the fact that the webinar is not recorded. And I think you know, obviously if you're going to record it, people will want to tune in and watch it. But one of the things that I love about what you're doing is that you do create an open forum. So oftentimes we direct people about this issue to YouTube videos or to recorded presentations, and there's no interaction allowed or involved in some of those and in many of those. And I think that that's a disservice to the cause. I think that we need to open the doors to questions, allow people to question in the chat or even in the open forum of a Zoom type of webinar, and have that discourse back and forth. Unfortunately, so many presenters are so afraid that the, Stratfordians will usurp their power or take over their webinar or ask them questions they don't want to answer, or I don't know what their fear is, but there's so many up there who are afraid of having any kind of discourse or conversation. So I love the fact that you do that. You open it up, you allow question and answer series, and that's important, and it's great.
Yeah. Well, I think, I'm not afraid, if you like, of participation. And that's because the approach is more a question of process rather than a product that I'm trying to sell. I haven't yet come out and said, I think the real author is X. Now, when I do that particular webinar, if I get round to part 3, then I think you probably would get lots of very challenging questions, and quite right too. I think the falsification of theory is it's what it's all about, and we should always be ready to listen to those who could contradict, whatever evidence we bring forward. I think like your podcast, what I like is that you encourage questioning and you're happy to consider any new data that may come up or any serious arguments. I think we should thrive on questioning because it's in all our interest to get at the truth. Nothing truer than truth. And I think you have to put your money where your mouth is and say you're welcome to come and question me about all the things I've said in the first webinar. And I haven't said anything. I've questioned, and you've given me answers, and the answers I'm arguing all lead away from Stratford. Take Italy. You say, well, okay, do you agree that the plays are saturated in Italian culture, in Commedia dell'arte, and even more specifically in a painting by Titian? Yes or no? Well, yes, I see you have a point. Well, where did the man from Stratford ever get this information about Commedia dell'arte? How did he get this information about Italy that Rowe talks about? And it's pretty convincing stuff, and it's empirical. So there's nothing to be afraid of. I think once you say, look, I think it's Edward de Vere, I think he did it, then they're going to start challenging you. They're going to say, well, what about this? What about that? And all you can say is, look, I have a ton of circumstantial connections between Edward de Vere and the plays, which I find fascinating. Whether it's proof that he wrote the plays, of course it's not proof. If we had the proof, there would be no discussion. We'd make the headlines. Everybody would be writing about it, and they would say, well, they were right all along. And I actually think one day, perhaps not in my lifetime, the time will come when they say, well, those skeptics were right all along. There was something wrong with the official narrative. But that remains to be seen.
I agree
But in the
that day
meantime,
is
well,
dawning. It will come soon. It will come sooner than we think. I think that the shift is happening. I think the wave has begun. And as you say, new scholars who are attached to universities who are going to claim a name for themselves and create their world for them as the older professors, fade off. I think that we're going to see a huge shift, and I'm excited about it, and I'm excited to talk to you about it and the other guests that I offer here on the program. As we wrap up, Luke, I look forward to presenting your information to my listeners so that they can find you and find your seminars and webinars. And I want to thank you so much for taking the time all the way from Greece to be here with us and share your insight into this fantastic literary mystery.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Before we conclude this episode, I want to remind you all that you can find links to more information about Luke and our other guests by visiting our Patreon page, where we post details about the show, past and future episodes, fun facts, and more. Just click on the red Patreon button on the homepage of our website, and you can find everything you need right there. All the links and details are available at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com. I'd like to give a shout out to this month's Quiller of the Month, Sandi Boney. Thank you, Sandi, for your continued support, and I hope you enjoy your free Quiller swag item from the swag shop. Don't forget, fellow Quillers, our next episode is the big number 100, celebrating our 4th anniversary and the start of a 5th season of exciting shows to come. Jake and I are busy lining up guests and prepping for future episodes, and we'll both be here for the next episode to share some of our favorite moments, notes, and comments from members of the Quiller Nation and more. As we approach this great milestone, we want to hear from you. Share your thoughts about your favorite episodes of all time, your thoughts about the last 4 years. Words of congratulations are perfectly suitable as well. Send your notes our way. Just email contact@don'tquillthepodcast.com, contact@don'tquillthepodcast.com. That's contact@don'tquillthepodcast.com. And until then, Quiller Nation, say it with me out loud so that those who are near you can hear you. Keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
It's Dragon Wagon.